Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. In Book 1 of his Masnavi, Hazrati Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi teaches us about who we are in terms of what is known as the nafs, which begs the question, who are we and what is the nafs? So let's start here. What do you see when you look in a mirror? Well, the obvious answer is, I see me. I see myself. But what is the me that I am actually seeing? When we look in the mirror, what we see is often called the looking glass self. We see the self in which we perceive how others might see us, and logically, how we perceive others might also judge us. This leads us to a partially accurate and a partially inaccurate view of ourselves, because our perspective is based only on what we perceive, which, as we said, may be partially accurate, but more than likely is also partially inaccurate, because we really don't know how others are actually judging us. Even more, our own perceptions of ourselves may just as well be inaccurate. We then create a belief system about how we measure our appearance and our self-worth that is in great part based on, or at least colored by, our own personal histories, which are full of positive and negative experiences, affirmations, traumas, and distortions of the events of our past that made us who we are, or at least who we think we are. The challenge for us is then to create a balance or an alignment between our internal self and our external self, so that we might form some sort of, if you will allow me to offer, a dynamic equilibrium in our lives, which gives us the ability to function in the world in social settings, and so that we can as well continually readjust our perception of ourselves, keeping the external influences and the internal narrative in balance rather than in competition. In the language of tasawwuf, that is, from the language of Sufism, we need to polish the mirror of our self-reflection so that we might be able to see ourselves accurately. The French philosopher and mathematician René Descartes, in his Discours de la méthode, his Discourse on the Method, written in 1637, originally wrote, Je pense, donc je suis. It was translated into Latin as cogito ergo sum. In English, we know this popular phrase as, I think, therefore I am. Put simply, Descartes understood that he had many false beliefs and wanted to find a method to ensure that he had only true beliefs and ultimately only truths. So he turned to doubt. He doubted that all false beliefs sourced in his senses and in his reason could be false, because he had been deceived by both of these in the past. Simply put, doubting is a way of thinking, and one's existence is required to doubt or think. It is interesting to add here that the French literary critic Antoine Léonard Thomas wrote in a 1756 essay in praise of Descartes. He said, Puisque je doute, je pense. Puisque je pense, j'existe. Since I doubt, I think. Since I think, I exist. It often appears in the Latin form, dubito ergo cogito ergo sum. I doubt, therefore I think, therefore I am. So according to Descartes, it is impossible to doubt and to not exist. So, if I doubt my own existence, because I am thinking about this, I must exist. I am doing the doubting. Therefore, I am doing the thinking. Therefore, I exist. As you know, Descartes is considered by many to be the father of modern philosophy. He used rationalism as a means to attain knowledge for the understanding of the world, and I would add, the understanding of the self. However, from a psychological perspective, what if my thoughts are inaccurate or erroneous, or for that matter, irrational? Maybe the who I think I am is inaccurate. Maybe the I that I see in the mirror of myself is distorted, and I do not see myself accurately. Maybe our internal dialogue is telling us untruths, like, I feel like a big loser. I feel worthless. I feel powerless, whereas in reality, what we really mean to say is, I think I'm a big loser. I think I am worthless. I think I am powerless, and so on. So, if we turn back to the logic of Descartes, then we have, I think all of these inaccurate and irrational things about myself, therefore, I am all of these things. Now, having been trained in therapy, I have to admit that I like the science part of all of this, especially the mind-brain science, the neuropsychology, the psychology of all of this. It would inform the work that I was doing every day back in America until I moved here to Konya. So, in asking the question, who am I? We must in the end talk about the ego. It's intellectually tempting to get sidetracked and to talk about the work of Freud und das Ich, the ego, the id, and the superego, or the work of Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget and his theory of cognitive development, or Jane Loevinger's stages of ego development, or Robert Selman and his theory of perspective taking, or Lawrence Kohlberg's stages of moral development that were based on Piaget's earlier works. So let me, even though I'm tempted, not engage in any more psychological, philosophical, existential conversation, well, at least for the moment. Now, the ancient Greeks seemed to realize that the self is inherently reflexive. That is, it reflects back on itself. It reflects back on the ego. The word ego comes from either the Greek or the Latin, depending on who's making the argument. I personally think it comes from the Greek ego, which is simply I, the first person singular. Now, the word ego has been in some ways misappropriated by New Age philosophies as a thing that needs to be erased. It is commonly used as an identifier for someone that has a big ego or someone who is egotistical or self-centered. Now, parenthetically, all of these actually speak to someone who has a weak, wounded, or underdeveloped ego. Now, asking the question, is ego an asset or a liability? Is it a gift or is it an affliction? So let's continue by affirming that the ego is something that just is, that in and of itself, it is something neither good nor bad. It is a necessary part of ourself. Ego might be, for our purposes, defined as the mind state with its own unique history and narratives with which we self-identify. The problem that we have in talking about the ego that is separate from grammar and separate from psychology is that no one really knows what it is, but everybody talks about it as if they do. Even the definition I have just given you makes me sound like that I know what I'm talking about, but in reality, it's just for our conversation. Ask me tomorrow, and I might give you a different definition. Now, about 130 years ago, William James, in his 1890 book, The Principles of Psychology, introduced the distinction between the I and the me, both referring to understandings of the self. Me corresponded to the self as an object of experience, whereas I corresponded to the self as a subject of experience. In other words, when I look in the mirror, either one, I see me in the mirror, that's the self as subject, or two, I see me in the mirror, that's the self as object. In other words, there is a self that is seen and a self that does the seeing. There is a story about Nasruddin Hoca, the legendary Turkish folk character who one day entered the palace and sat himself in the most elegant chair in the receiving area. The chief of the guard saw him and with great decor walked over to him and said, "Efendim." Now, Efendim means something like my lord or my master or sir, something like that. So he said, "Efendim, these chairs are reserved for the guests of honor." "My good sir, I am more than a mere guest," replied Nasruddin without blinking an eye. "Oh, so you must be a diplomat then?" "Oh, I am far more than that," said Nasruddin. "Oh, then you must be a minister of some sort." No, even bigger than that." "Mashallah, then you must be the king himself, Effendim," the chief retorted sarcastically. "Even higher than that," said Nasruddin. "What? Do you think you are higher than the king? In this village, nobody is higher than the king." Nasruddin laughed. "Aha! Now you have it. I am nobody." So you see, the chief of the guard was caught up in the appearances and status, in the externals, in the self that is seen. Nasruddin is teaching us how paradoxically that if we abandon the illusion of being somebody, we might then be able to exceed our own limitations of who or what we think ourselves to be. We are the result of our history, but we are not what our stories tell us, because the stories we tell ourselves are events that have gone by and have ceased to exist. We are the sum of the events and experiences of our lives, and we are also not. We are what we are in this moment, but the perception of ourself may be filled with distortions and untruths. In reality, we are both the I with its truths and untruths, and the me with its truths and untruths. The challenge is to bring them both into a healthy and accurate alignment with each other with the best possible accurate information that is available to us. I was once told by a friend that in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, Stephen B. once said, "This is the story that I tell, but then there are the facts."